some legends aren't born from bullets and bloodshed, but from the quiet strength that transforms broken spirits into unshakable foundations. In the rugged expanse of Arizona Territory, where the sun carved deep lines into weathered faces and survival demanded more than mere courage, there lived stories of extraordinary people who shaped destinies with calloused hands and patient hearts. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Men like Iron Will Morrison, who could break a Mustang with whispered words, or Alina Steel Spine Rodriguez, who single-handedly defended her homestead against Apache raids for 3 consecutive winters. But perhaps none left a more profound impact than Cassandra Rivera, a woman whose very presence could turn frightened boys into fearless men, and whose teaching methods would become the stuff of territorial legend. The daughter of a decorated cavalry officer and Apache medicine woman, Cass had learned early that true strength wasn't measured by the loudness of one's voice or the speed of one's draw, but by the unwavering resolve to protect what mattered most. Those who witnessed her work would later speak of miracles disguised as daily lessons, of boys who arrived broken and left whole, of a ranch that became a sanctuary where courage was cultivated like precious crops. She once told a desperate father, "Strength isn't something you're born with, Marcus. It's something you choose to build, one decision at a time, until it becomes as natural as breathing." The dust devil that preceded Marcus Webb's arrival at Thunder Creek Ranch seemed fitting. Somehow, a swirling testament to the desperation that had driven him across 300 miles of unforgiving desert. It was the summer of 1878, and the Arizona Territory baked under a merciless sun that turned the earth to powder and men's hopes to ash. Cassandra Rivera watched from her porch as the lone rider approached, noting the way he sat his horse with the rigid posture of a man carrying invisible weights. Thunder Creek Ranch sprawled across 2,000 acres of some of the finest grazing land in Painted Mesa Valley, where spring-fed streams carved green ribbons through golden grassland, and ancient cottonwoods provided blessed shade during the scorching afternoon hours. The ranch house itself stood like a fortress against the elements, built from local sandstone and timber that Cass had personally selected and cut. Its wraparound porch commanded a view of the entire valley, and those wide windows could spot trouble coming from miles away. Cass had purchased the property 5 years earlier from the estate of Samuel Thornton, an elderly rancher whose heart had finally given out after decades of battling the land into submission. The locals in Copper Ridge had whispered about the wisdom of a woman, especially one barely past 30, taking on such an ambitious undertaking. They'd stopped whispering after the first year, when her cattle thrived while others struggled through a particularly harsh winter, and her innovative water management system kept the grasslands green when neighboring spreads turned brown. Marcus Webb dismounted near the hitching post with the careful movements of a man whose bones carried old injuries. His clothes marked him as a town dweller, clean and pressed despite the long journey, and his soft hands spoke of work done with ledgers, rather than livestock. But it was his eyes that caught Cass's attention as she rose from her rocking chair. Eyes that held the particular kind of exhaustion that came from watching someone you love slowly disappear. "Ma'am," he said, removing his hat to reveal prematurely gray hair and deep worry lines. "I'm looking for Cassandra Rivera. Been told she might be able to help with a particular kind of problem." "You found her," Cass replied, studying the man with the same careful attention she gave to evaluating new stock. "Though I suspect your problem isn't with cattle or horses." Webb's laugh held no humor. "No, ma'am, it's not. My name's Marcus Webb. I've come from Tucson about my boy Dylan. He's 14, and I'm afraid I'm losing him to something I don't know how to fight." The admission seemed to cost him considerable effort, the words emerging like pulled teeth. Cass had seen this before. Proud men who'd built their lives on being providers and protectors, suddenly faced with challenges that couldn't be solved with money or authority. She gestured toward the porch chairs, noting how the man's shoulders seemed to relax slightly at the invitation. "Tell me about Dylan," she said simply, pouring water from a clay pitcher into 2 glasses. The liquid was cool and sweet, drawn from the deep well that tapped into an underground spring. Marcus accepted the glass gratefully, his throat working as he drained half of it before speaking. "He's my only child. My wife died bringing him into this world. I've tried to give him everything, the best schools, the finest clothes, opportunities. I never had growing up poor in St. Louis, but lately, he's been getting into fights, running with rough boys, coming home with cuts and bruises he won't explain." He paused, staring out at the valley where Cass's cattle grazed peacefully in the distance. "Last month, he was arrested for starting a brawl in a saloon. A saloon, ma'am. My 14-year-old boy was drinking whiskey and throwing punches at grown men. The sheriff in Tucson, he told me that Dylan's heading down a path that ends in prison or worse." "What does Dylan say about all this?" Cass asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Nothing. He looks at me like I'm the enemy, like everything I've tried to give him is somehow wrong. I don't understand it. I've provided for him, protected him, made sure he never wanted for anything." Cass set down her glass and leaned back in her chair, the wood creaking softly under her weight. "Mr. Webb, what do you do for a living?" The question seemed to surprise him. "I own Webb Banking and Investment. 3 branches across the territory, handling loans for ranchers, miners, business owners. I've worked 18-hour days for 20 years to build something substantial." "And Dylan? What does he do while you're building your empire?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "He has tutors, of course, the best education money can buy. A housekeeper who looks after him, makes sure he's fed and clothed properly. I've hired companions for him, young men from good families to provide proper influence." "But what does he do? What challenges him? What makes him feel proud of himself?" The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried as it circled above the grassland, and the afternoon breeze carried the scent of sage and wildflowers. Marcus Webb stared at his hands, clean and soft from a life spent indoors, and Cass could see the moment when understanding began to dawn. "I see," she said gently. "You've given him everything except the chance to earn something for himself." "I wanted to spare him the hardships I faced," Marcus said quietly. "Growing up poor, working in factories, fighting for every scrap. I thought if I could give him comfort and security." "You'd give him the childhood you wish you'd had," Cass finished. "But children aren't meant to be comfortable all the time, Mr. Webb. They're meant to be challenged, tested, given opportunities to fail and learn from those failures. When you take that away, they'll find their own challenges, and they're rarely the kind you'd choose for them." In the town of Copper Ridge, 15 miles south of Thunder Creek Ranch, word had already begun to spread about Marcus Webb's visit. Elena Vasquez, who owned the general store that served as the unofficial hub of local information, had spotted the well-dressed stranger's horse tied outside the Miller's boarding house the night before. The man had asked carefully worded questions about Cassandra Rivera, the kind of questions that suggested he knew more about her reputation than most newcomers. Sheriff Tom Bradley, a steady man in his 50s who'd kept the peace in Copper Ridge for over a decade, had made it his business to learn what he could about the visitor. Webb's credentials checked out. His banking business was legitimate and successful, but there was something in his manner that spoke of a man carrying more than financial concerns. "Heard he's got troubles with his boy," Elena confided to Dr. Patricia Monroe as the physician made her weekly stop for medical supplies. Asked about whether Miss Rivera really could help with difficult cases. Pat Monroe, who delivered half the babies in the valley and patched up the other half when they got into scrapes, nodded thoughtfully. "Cass has a gift with young people. No denying that. But it's not magic, it's hard work and wisdom. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The question is whether the city banker is prepared for what that means. At Thunder Creek Ranch, Cass was explaining exactly what it would mean. If you decide to leave Dylan here, and that's a big if because the choice has to be his, he won't be a guest or a student in any traditional sense. He'll be a working member of this ranch, expected to earn his keep and contribute to our success. There won't be tutors or housekeepers, no one to clean up his mistakes or smooth his path. Marcus leaned forward, his expression intent. What exactly would he be doing? Everything. Mucking stalls, mending fences, herding cattle, breaking horses, learning to read the weather and the land. He'll work from dawn to dusk, and when he's not working, he'll be studying things that matter out here. How to track animals, how to find water, how to survive when everything goes wrong. She stood and walked to the porch railing, her hands resting on the smooth wood. But more than that, he'll learn responsibility. Not just for himself, but for others. The cattle depend on us for their survival. The horses need daily care, and during calving season, a moment's inattention can mean life or death for a newborn. Calf, and you think this will help him, this hard labor? Cass turned to face him, her expression serious. Mr. Webb, I think your boy is angry because he's never been needed. He's been provided for, protected, managed, but never truly needed. When a young man realizes that others depend on him, that his efforts matter, that his choices have real consequences, it changes something fundamental inside him. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Marcus found himself studying this remarkable woman who spoke with such quiet confidence about transforming his troubled son. Cassandra Rivera stood perhaps 5.5 feet tall, with the lean, strong build of someone who worked with her hands every day. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and her clothes were functional rather than fashionable, designed for movement and durability rather than appearance. But it was her presence that truly impressed him. She moved with an economy of motion that suggested absolute confidence in her capabilities, and when she spoke, her words carried the weight of hard-earned experience. There was no boasting or exaggeration, just plain statements of fact delivered, with quiet authority. How do you know it will work? Marcus asked finally. I don't, Cass admitted. Every young person is different, and what reaches one might not touch another. But I can tell you this, I've never had a boy leave here the same way he arrived. Some discover they're stronger than they knew, others learn that real strength comes from gentleness. All of them learn that their actions matter. She rejoined him at the table, her movements graceful despite the practical boots and work clothes. But before we go any further, you need to understand something important. This isn't a school or a reform program. This is a working ranch, and everyone here earns their place. That includes Dylan, and it includes you. Me? Marcus looked startled. I don't understand. If your boy stays here, you'll be expected to visit regularly, not as an observer, but as a participant. You'll work alongside him, learn the same lessons, face the same challenges. Because part of Dylan's problem isn't just that he's never been needed, it's that he's never seen his father struggle, fail, and get back up. The proposition clearly hadn't occurred to Marcus, and Cass could see him wrestling with the implications. A successful banker, accustomed to delegating physical labor and managing through authority rather than example, would find the transition challenging. I don't know anything about ranch work, he said slowly. Neither did Dylan, I guess. Neither did I when I first arrived here. The land doesn't care about your background, Mr. Webb. It only cares about your willingness to learn and your determination to persevere. As if summoned by their conversation, a rider appeared on the eastern trail, approaching at an easy lope that suggested familiarity with the terrain. Cass recognized Isaiah Thompson, known to everyone as Zeke, an elderly man who'd worked ranches throughout the territory for more than 40 years. His weathered face and gnarled hands told stories of decades spent under the southwestern sun, and his knowledge of cattle and horses was legendary among local ranchers. Zeke dismounted at the hitching post with the fluid grace of a man-half. His age, though Marcus noted the careful way he favored his left leg, evidence of an old injury that had never quite healed properly. He touched the brim of his hat respectfully to Cass, before acknowledging the stranger with a polite nod. "Evening." Miss Rivera came by to check on that mare with the limp. "She's walking sound now. Should be ready for light work by week's end." "Thank you, Zeke. Mr. Webb, I'd like you to meet Isaiah Thompson, the finest horseman in 3 territories and the man who taught me most of what I know about reading livestock." The old cowboy's eyes sharpened as he studied Marcus, taking in the soft hands and town clothes with the practiced assessment of someone who'd spent a lifetime evaluating men's capabilities. "Pleasure, Mr. Webb. You thinking about getting into the ranching business?" "Actually," Marcus said carefully, "I'm considering leaving my son here to learn from Miss Rivera. I've heard she has a particular talent for working with difficult young people." Zeke's weathered face creased into what might have been a smile. "Difficult young people, you say? Well, I reckon Cass knows something about that. Helped plenty of boys find their way over the years." "Really?" Marcus leaned forward with interest. "Could you give me an example?" The old cowboy exchanged a glance with Cass, who nodded slightly. "Well, there was Tommy Martinez, came here about 3 years back. His family sent him after he'd been caught stealing horses over in Tucson. Angry kid, thought the world owed him something special." Zeke settled onto the porch steps, clearly preparing for a longer tale. "First week, that boy tried to run off 4 different times. Cass just kept bringing him back, putting him to work, treating him like his behavior was normal teenage foolishness, rather than criminal activity. By the 2nd month, he was working dawn to dusk without complaint, and by the end of 6 months, he decided he wanted to be a veterinarian." "What happened to him?" "Last I heard, he was in his 2nd year at the Territorial Agricultural College, top of his class in animal husbandry. Still writes to Cass every month, asking for advice and sharing what he's learning." Marcus found himself impressed despite his skepticism. "And this transformation, it was just due to hard work?" "Hard work was part of it," Cass interjected. "But the real change came when Tommy realized that the horses and cattle needed him. When you're responsible for living creatures that depend on you for their survival, it changes your perspective on your own importance." She stood and walked to the edge of the porch, gazing out at the valley where her cattle grazed peacefully in the golden evening light. "Tommy started stealing horses because he felt powerless and wanted to prove he could take whatever he desired. But when he learned to care for horses, to understand their needs and respond to their trust, he discovered a different kind of power. The power to nurture rather than destroy." As the evening shadows lengthened across Thunder Creek Ranch, Marcus Webb found himself facing a decision that would alter the course of his son's life, and quite possibly his own. The woman standing before him offered no guarantees, no easy solutions, only the promise of hard work and the possibility of transformation through genuine challenge and responsibility. In the distance, a coyote's call echoed across the valley. Wild and free, a reminder that this land demanded strength from all who chose to make it their home. Tomorrow, Marcus would return to Copper Ridge to collect Dylan and face the most difficult conversation of their relationship. Tonight, he sat on the porch of Thunder Creek Ranch and tried to imagine his soft, angry, troubled son finding purpose in this place of endless horizons and hard-earned wisdom. The first chapter of their story was ending, but the real test was about to begin. The morning sun barely crested the eastern ridges when Marcus Webb rode back toward Thunder Creek Ranch. His son Dylan slouched in the saddle beside him like a sack of grain that wished it were anywhere else. The boy's posture spoke volumes about his attitude toward this forced exile from civilization, his expensive clothes already dusty from the trail, and his dark hair falling across sullen eyes that refused to meet his father's gaze. Dylan Webb possessed the kind of lean build that suggested he'd eventually grow into his gangly limbs, but for now he appeared all elbows and knees, uncomfortable in his own skin and suspicious of everyone around him. His face carried the soft features of youth, combined with the hard expression of someone who'd seen too much of the worst in people, or perhaps more accurately, someone who'd been shielded from seeing the best. The conversation during their journey from Copper Ridge had been minimal and strained. Marcus had attempted to explain the reasoning behind this decision, while Dylan had responded with increasingly creative variations of sullen silence punctuated by occasional outbursts of indignation. The boy clearly viewed this as punishment rather than opportunity, another example of his father's attempts to control his life through financial manipulation. Cassandra Rivera stood on her porch watching their approach, and she noticed immediately how Dylan sat his horse. The boy had natural balance and instinctive timing, suggesting he'd spent some time around horses despite his urban upbringing. His clothes marked him as privileged, from the fine leather boots to the silk shirt that probably cost more than most ranch hands earned in a month. But there was something in his bearing that reminded her of a young Mustang, wild and wary and ready to bolt at the first sign of real pressure. As they dismounted, Dylan's first words confirmed her assessment. "This is kidnapping, you know. I'm old enough to make my own decisions about where I live." "Yes, you are," Cass replied calmly, surprising him with her agreement. "Which is why you're going to decide right now whether you stay or go. Your father brought you here, but staying is completely your choice." Dylan blinked, expecting resistance, not understanding. "How exactly do you mean?" he asked. "You can mount that horse and ride back to Copper Ridge anytime you like. Sheriff Bradley will get you to Tucson, no questions asked. But if you choose to stay, you'll play by the same rules as everyone working here." Cass gestured toward the ranch buildings where morning chores were already underway. Thunder Creek Ranch isn't a reform school or punishment farm. It's a functioning cattle operation, and every person contributes to its success. You don't get a place here because of your father's money. You earn it through your own effort. Marcus opened his mouth to intercede, but Cass lifted a hand to stop him. This was a conversation between her and Dylan, and only her and Dylan. The boy studied Cass's expression, trying to find any hidden agenda or subtle hierarchy, an instinct honed by years of being managed and manipulated. "What kind of work would I be doing?" he finally asked, sounding braced for either meaningless tasks or impossible physical trials meant to break him. "Today, you'll help me check the north pasture for evidence of wolf activity. We've lost 3 calves this week, and we need to figure out whether it's a lone predator or a pack. Then we'll repair fence along Moonstone Creek, and this evening we'll work with a young stallion that needs basic ground training." Cass paused. Dylan's expression softened even amid his turbulence. He'd always gravitated toward animals, trusting them more than most people. "Really, you'd let me work with the horses? If you prove responsible. Horses don't give a damn about your father's reputation or wealth. They respond to consistency, patience, and respect. Show those qualities, and you can learn plenty." There was no hostility in her tone, just firm expectations. Dylan found himself torn between rejecting this forced move and a real curiosity sparked by the offer to work with livestock, something he'd never been afforded before. "Fine," he muttered, trying to retain a martyr's posture. "But when this doesn't work out, don't blame me." "I wouldn't dream of it," Cass replied with a faint smile. "Mr. Webb, you're welcome to watch today, but starting tomorrow you'll participate. I've arranged lodging at the Miller boarding house in town for now. Eventually you'll bunk here when your son does." Marcus shifted uneasily, yet he'd already agreed to this trial by fire. "What will I be learning, exactly?" he asked. "Exactly the same things Dylan learns. Reading cattle behaviors, maintaining gear, working with others instead of issuing commands. You want your son to grow stronger. Mr. Webb's strength comes through example, not just words. Not long after, they rode toward the north pasture. Dylan anticipated a gentle onboarding, but Cass surprised him. She handed over a rifle and showed him how to look for predator signs. Wolves hunt methodically, she explained as they rode through jawing cattle. They probe herds for weak or isolated animals, then exploit any vulnerable gap. Our job is to think like predators, see the terrain and cattle through their eyes. Dylan gripped the rifle and found himself genuinely interested. This wasn't trophy hunting or scoring points. It was protecting creatures that depended on human vigilance. It felt meaningful. Near a stand of juniper, Cass dismounted and pointed to churned soil and large tracks. "What do you see here?" she asked. "Looks like something dragged. Tracks too large for coyotes." "Good. What else?" Dylan leaned closer. "The drag marks go toward those rocks, like the carcass was moved. There's no blood trail. It was a quick kill." "Excellent. What does that tell us about the predator?" "An experienced wolf, probably adult, hunting efficiently. Taking cattle to a den suggests there may be pups to feed." Cass nodded knowingly. "You've got good instincts. Most only see livestock losses. You're uncovering broader patterns." For the first time at Thunder Creek Ranch, Dylan felt true pride, not the hollow kind of showing off, but the satisfaction of solving a real problem using his own mind. He'd spent years rebelling against limitations, but he'd forgotten how rewarding it was to exceed them. Up next, fence repair. A task even Marcus hadn't expected to be this demanding. The section by Moonstone Creek had been torn up by flash floods, posts uprooted, wire tossed, and required them to reset everything in rocky soil, restringing with keen attention to tension. Cass joined in, demonstrating techniques and then letting both men grapple with the task's physical toll. Within the first hour, blisters rose on Dylan's soft hands, and his father's hands weren't faring any better. There was clarity in the shared hardship. Manual labor strips away social divides, confronting both equally. When Marcus struggled setting a post, Dylan stepped forward, not to taunt, but to help. Their mutual inexperience forged a rare moment of cooperation. Cass filled their water break with her philosophy. This land doesn't negotiate, hurting no one's intentions, honoring no excuses. The fence either holds cattle or it doesn't. The work is either right or it's not. People find that honesty refreshing once they acclimate. Marcus's shirt was soaked, his manicured hands already calloused. "I see why you insisted I do this." "Dylan sees my struggle firsthand." Cass nodded. "More than that, he watches. You persist, learning from mistakes instead of rationalizing. That lesson outweighs any lecture on perseverance." By evening came the horse training, a youthful stallion named Copper, fiery and uncooperative. Dylan discovered his earlier confidence was premature. The stallion was neither aggressive nor weak-willed, simply unimpressed. Dylan tugged the lead rope, demanding compliance. Copper stood firm, unyielding. Cass offered calm guidance. "Stop, breathe. Are you trying to lead him or overpower him?" Dylan admitted, "I'm making him walk a circle." "Actually, you're trying to prove you're stronger. That's a different goal, and a losing one. Copper is 1,200 pounds, bred for strength. You, by comparison, are lean and untrained." It stung. "So how do I get him to cooperate?" "Earn respect rather than demand submission. Ask, don't force." Dylan tried again, this time gentle and deliberate. Copper hesitated, then stepped forward. His ears pricked, posture softened. Collaboration replaced resistance. Marcus watched closely. The parallels were unmistakable. How many times had he tried to force results through money or authority rather than earning real respect? Night descended on Thunder Creek Ranch with clarity. Dylan felt genuine exhaustion born of contribution, not emotional weariness. Marcus reflected on strength and leadership, how his attempts to insulate his son had inadvertently stunned him. Dylan slept without bitterness for the first time in months, his body sore but his spirit quietly curious about tomorrow. Marcus drafted a letter explaining his absence in town, struggling to describe education happening in pastures, fence lines, corrals. Cass watched the stars over painted Mesa Valley, pondering what lay ahead. Potential meant little without humility and perseverance. She knew transformation wasn't born in dramatic moments, but through countless small actions, consistent effort, mistakes learned from, responsibility earned. For the first time, both Webmen slept with hope instead of resentment. In the valley, a coyote's cry reminded them, this land demands cooperation, not domination. And it was just the beginning of their true education. But as they approached the south pasture, Cassandra Rivera's expression grew increasingly grim. 15 head of prime breeding stock lay scattered across the grassland, their bodies bloated and still in the morning heat. Dylan's stomach lurched at the sight, not just from the visceral shock of death on such a scale, but from the immediate understanding that this represented catastrophic financial loss. These weren't just animals. They represented months of careful breeding, years of genetic selection, and thousands of dollars in investment. Poison, Cass said simply, kneeling beside the nearest carcass and examining the foam around its muzzle. Someone contaminated the water source feeding this section. Probably strychnine, judging by the symptoms. Dylan had never seen her look so defeated. For 3 weeks, he'd watched this remarkable woman handle every challenge with calm competence, finding solutions where others saw only problems. Now, confronted with deliberate sabotage, even Cassandra Rivera seemed shaken by the magnitude of the loss. Who would do something like this? Dylan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Someone who wants Thunder Creek Ranch to fail, she replied, standing and brushing dust from her knees. Someone who benefits from my financial troubles or simply enjoys causing suffering. The ride back to the ranch house passed in heavy silence, each of them processing the implications of what they'd discovered. Dylan found himself thinking not about his own problems or his father's expectations, but about the impact this loss would have on Cass and the ranch operation she'd built through years of careful planning and hard work. Marcus arrived from town. Just as they reached the main buildings, his face brightening with anticipation of sharing some minor business success. The expression faded instantly when he saw their grim faces and heard the news about the poisoned cattle. How bad is it financially? He asked with the direct concern of someone who understood business realities. Bad enough, Cass admitted. Those animals represented nearly a third of my breeding program. The immediate loss is significant, but the long-term impact on genetic diversity and herd improvement could set the ranch back years. Dylan watched his father's face, recognizing the calculating expression that appeared when Marcus Webb identified a problem that money might solve. I could provide emergency funding, Marcus offered. Consider it an investment in Dylan's education rather than charity. No, Cass said firmly. This ranch succeeds or fails on its own merits. Taking your money wouldn't solve the real problem, which is that someone in this valley wants me gone. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Tom Bradley, accompanied by a stranger whose expensive clothes and confident bearing marked him as someone accustomed to wielding authority. The newcomer dismounted with the casual arrogance of a man who expected others to accommodate his presence. Miss Rivera, the sheriff said, his tone carefully neutral. Like you to meet Vincent Hartwell. He owns the Double H spread up near Eagles. Rest, been asking to speak with you about some business matters. Vincent Hartwell possessed the kind of aggressive handsomeness that impressed weak-willed people and set stronger individuals on edge. His perfectly groomed mustache and expensive boots spoke of wealth, while his calculating eyes suggested the kind of intelligence that viewed other people as resources to be exploited rather than respected. Terrible shame about your cattle. Hartwell said without preamble, his voice carrying just enough false sympathy to make his real feelings clear. Seems like this valley's becoming increasingly dangerous for small operations. Lucky for you, I've been authorized to make a generous offer for your property. Dylan felt his hands clench into fists at the man's barely concealed smugness. Even at 14, he possessed enough understanding of human nature to recognize predatory behavior when he saw it. This wasn't a businessman making a legitimate offer. This was a vulture circling wounded prey. Authorized by whom? Cass asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Territorial Development Corporation. We're putting together a large-scale cattle operation, combining several smaller spreads into a more efficient enterprise. Your ranch would be a valuable addition to our holdings. And if I'm not interested in selling? Hartwell's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Well, that would be unfortunate. Small ranchers face so many challenges. These days, disease, predators, accidents. Sometimes it's better to accept reality before circumstances force your hand. The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Dylan found himself stepping closer to Cass in an instinctive gesture of support. Marcus, recognizing the dynamics at play, moved to flank Hartwell, his banker's instincts alert to the smell of corruption and intimidation. I think you've made your position clear, Mr. Hartwell, Sheriff Bradley said carefully. Perhaps it's time to let Miss Rivera consider your proposal in private. Of course, Hartwell replied, mounting his horse with theatrical flair. But I wouldn't wait too long to decide. The Territorial Corporation doesn't like to keep offers open indefinitely, and this valley seems to be getting more dangerous every day. As they watched him ride away, Dylan felt something shift inside his chest, a hot surge of protective anger unlike anything he'd experienced during his months of rebellion in Tucson. This wasn't the unfocused rage of adolescent frustration. This was righteous fury at witnessing injustice directed toward someone he'd come to respect and care about. He's the one who poisoned the cattle, Dylan said with absolute certainty. Probably, Cass agreed. But proving it and doing something about it are different challenges entirely. So we just let him get away with it? Cass studied Dylan's face, noting the intensity of his reaction and the protective stance he'd unconsciously adopted. We do what ranchers have always done when faced with threats. We work harder, plan smarter, and refuse to be intimidated into surrender. The next morning brought a different kind of lesson as Cass introduced Dylan and Marcus to the grim reality of salvaging what they could from the poisoned pasture. The dead cattle had to be buried quickly to prevent contamination and disease, requiring hours of backbreaking labor in the growing heat. Dylan had never worked so hard in his life. The physical demands of digging graves large enough for 15 head of cattle pushed his developing body beyond anything he'd previously experienced. His hands, already toughened by 3 weeks of ranch work, developed new blisters that burst and reformed throughout the long day. But more challenging than the physical labor was the emotional weight of the task. Each animal they buried represented not just financial loss, but the destruction of something beautiful and valuable through human malice. Dylan found himself grieving for creatures he'd never known. Feeling personally violated by the attack on Thunder Creek Ranch, Marcus struggled alongside his son, his banker's soft hands bleeding within the first hour as he learned to use tools designed for hard labor rather than delicate manipulation. But rather than complaining or seeking easier alternatives, he matched Dylan's determination to complete the necessary work regardless of personal cost. Why do you stay? Dylan asked Cass during a brief rest break, his voice hoarse from exertion. And Dust, why not just sell to Hartwell and find somewhere easier to live? Because easy isn't the point, she replied, offering him water from a clay jug that stayed cool even in the desert heat. If I ran from every challenge, I'd never accomplish anything worth doing. This land chose me as much as I chose it, and I don't abandon commitments just because they become difficult. But you could start over somewhere else, build a new ranch, where people weren't trying to destroy your work. Cass was quiet for a long moment, staring across the valley toward the mountains where afternoon shadows were beginning to gather. Dylan, what do you think would happen to the next person who tried to build something here if I gave up and walked away? The question forced Dylan to consider consequences beyond his immediate concern for Cass's well-being. Hartwell would probably target them too. Exactly. And the person after that, and the one after that, until this entire valley became nothing but corporate rangeland with no room for independent operators or small communities. Sometimes we fight not just for ourselves, but for the principle that decent people shouldn't have to surrender to bullies. That evening brought an unexpected visitor as Elena Vasquez rode out from Copper Ridge with news that sent new ripples of concern through the ranch. 3 more small operations had received similar offers from the Territorial Development Corporation, accompanied by subtle threats about the increasing dangers of independent ranching. People are scared, Elena reported as they gathered on the ranch house porch. The Morrison family has already decided to sell rather than risk losing everything to mysterious accidents. Others are starting to think maybe corporate ownership would provide more security. And Sheriff Bradley? Cass asked. Doing what he can, but he's one man covering a lot of territory. Hartwell's been careful to avoid anything that could be proven in court, and the territorial authorities seem reluctant to investigate corporate land acquisitions too closely. Dylan listened to this adult conversation with growing understanding of how power worked in the real world. It wasn't enough to be right or hardworking or morally justified. You also had to be smart enough to outmaneuver people who played by different rules entirely. What if we could prove he poisoned the cattle? Dylan asked. Would that be enough to stop him? It would help, Elena replied. But we'd need more than suspicion. We'd need evidence that would convince a territorial judge, and Hartwell's probably been careful to cover his tracks. Marcus had been quiet during this exchange, but now he leaned forward with the focused attention Dylan recognized from his father's business dealings. What if we approached this differently? Instead of trying to prove past crimes, what if we prevented future ones? How? Cass asked. By making Thunder Creek Ranch too visible to attack safely. Hartwell's been operating in shadows, counting on isolated targets and community fear. What if we removed both advantages? The plan that emerged from their discussion was audacious in its simplicity. Rather than hiding from Hartwell's threats or hoping for outside assistance, they would turn Thunder Creek Ranch into a symbol of resistance that the entire territory could rally behind. Dylan found himself at the center of this strategy, his unique position as an educated outsider making him valuable in ways he'd never imagined. His job would be to document everything, creating a detailed record of ranch operations, community interactions, and any suspicious activities that might represent future attacks. You want me to be a spy? Dylan asked, uncertain whether to feel honored or terrified by the responsibility. I want you to be a witness, Cass replied. Someone whose word carries weight because he has no financial stake in the outcome and no history of conflict with Hartwell. Your father's business reputation adds credibility to anything you report. Marcus nodded approvingly. Dylan's always been observant and analytical. This gives him a chance to use those skills for something important, rather than just finding new ways to get into trouble. For the first time since arriving at Thunder Creek Ranch, Dylan felt truly needed rather than merely tolerated. The adults weren't just finding him useful work to keep him busy. They were entrusting him with responsibilities that could affect the outcome of a serious conflict. The next few days transformed the ranch from an isolated operation into a hub of community activity. Elena Vasquez helped organize visits from other small ranchers, creating opportunities for Dylan to observe and document the growing pressure being applied throughout the valley. Each visitor brought new stories of subtle intimidation and escalating threats. Water sources mysteriously contaminated, fence lines cut in patterns that suggested systematic sabotage, cattle scattered by riders who disappeared before they could be identified or confronted. Dylan recorded everything in a detailed journal, noting patterns and connections that might not be obvious to people living through individual incidents. His banker's sun eye for detail and his outsider's perspective on local relationships allowed him to see the bigger picture emerging from seemingly random events. More importantly, the work gave him a sense of purpose that transformed his entire attitude toward life at Thunder Creek Ranch. Instead of serving time until he could return to Tucson, he was now actively contributing to something meaningful, using his intelligence and education to protect people he'd come to care about. Marcus watched his son's transformation with growing amazement. The sullen, rebellious teenager who'd arrived 3 weeks earlier was becoming a focused young man who took pride in his contributions and sought additional responsibilities rather than avoiding them. He's found something worth fighting for, Cass observed one evening as they watched Dylan carefully updating his records by lamplight. That changes everything about how a person approaches challenges. I'm beginning to understand that myself, Marcus admitted. I spent so many years trying to protect him from difficulty that I never gave him the chance to discover what he was capable of accomplishing. The revelation marked a turning point not just in Dylan's development, but in the relationship between father and son. Marcus began staying at the ranch more frequently, participating in the daily work rather than observing from a distance, earning his place in the community through effort rather than expecting it through financial contribution. But even as the Webb family found new strength and purpose, Vincent Hartwell was preparing to escalate his campaign against Thunder Creek Ranch. The unity and resistance he'd encountered had convinced him that subtle pressure wouldn't be sufficient to achieve his goals. The real test of everything Dylan and Marcus had learned was approaching, and it would require more than just hard work and good intentions to survive what Hartwell was planning. The lessons of Thunder Creek Ranch were about to face their ultimate examination, and the stakes were rising far beyond simple ranch ownership into questions of community, survival, and the right of decent people to live without fear. In the distance, storm clouds gathered over Eagle's Rest Mountains, promising the kind of weather that could transform creek beds into raging torrents and test every structure's ability to withstand nature's fury. But the storm approaching Thunder Creek Ranch wasn't meteorological. It was human in origin and far more dangerous than anything the Arizona weather could produce. The education of Dylan Webb was about to enter its most crucial phase, where all the lessons about responsibility, courage, and community would be tested under pressure that would either forge lasting character or reveal the limitations of good intentions when confronted with genuine evil. The attack came on a moonless night when the darkness lay thick across Painted Mesa Valley like a suffocating blanket. Dylan Webb woke to the acrid smell of smoke and the distant sound of cattle lowing in distress, their voices carrying a note of panic that cut through his sleep-fogged consciousness like a blade. He rolled from his bunk and stumbled to the window, where orange flames danced against the star-filled sky from the direction of the main barn. Thunder Creek Ranch had become a powder keg over the past week, with tensions escalating as more small ranchers reported incidents of sabotage and intimidation. Vincent Hartwell's Territorial Development Corporation had grown bolder in their tactics, no longer bothering to maintain even the pretense of legitimate business practices. Tonight, it seemed, they decided to abandon subtlety entirely. Dylan pulled on his clothes and boots with practiced efficiency, the movements automatic after a month of early morning ranch work. But this wasn't a normal dawn call to chores. This was the emergency he'd been dreading since Hartwell's first threatening visit. He grabbed the rifle Cass had taught him to use and headed for the main house, where lights were already blazing in every window. Cassandra Rivera stood on her front porch fully dressed, her dark hair braided back and her expression calm despite the crisis unfolding around her. She'd been expecting this escalation, had prepared for it with the methodical thoroughness that characterized everything she did. But seeing her life's work under direct assault still sent a cold fury through her that threatened to override her careful planning. "How bad is it?" Dylan asked as he joined her, noting the way she held her Winchester with familiar competence. "They fired the hay barn and scattered the remuda," she replied, using the Spanish term for the horse herd that Dylan had learned during his time at the ranch. "But they made a mistake. They assumed we'd panic and respond predictably." Marcus appeared from the guest quarters, his banker's clothes replaced by the practical work gear he'd learned to appreciate during his extended stay. His transformation over the past month had been almost as dramatic as his son's, from a soft-handed businessman to someone who could handle himself in physical confrontations. The rifle in his hands looked natural rather than foreign, evidence of hours spent learning from Cass and the other ranch hands. "I sent Isaiah to alert Sheriff Bradley and Alina Vasquez," Marcus reported. "If Hartwell thinks he can destroy this place without consequences, he's about to learn otherwise." The next few hours tested everything Dylan had learned about courage. Under pressure. The fire in the hay barn spread quickly despite their efforts to contain it, consuming months of stored feed and threatening to jump to other structures. But even as they fought the flames with bucket brigades and wet blankets, Dylan noticed that Cass seemed oddly unconcerned about the loss of the building. "You expected this," he realized as they paused to assess their progress. "You wanted them to target the barn." "The hay was insured, and we moved the most valuable equipment last week," Cass confirmed. "Better to let them think they're winning while we gather evidence of their methods." It was a lesson in strategic thinking that impressed Dylan more than any textbook example. Cass hadn't just prepared for this attack. She'd shaped it, channeling Hartwell's aggression in directions that served her purposes rather than his. The burned barn would become evidence of arson. The scattered horses could be recovered, and the attackers had revealed their tactics and timing. But the night's challenges were far from over. As dawn approached, and the immediate fire danger passed, riders appeared on the ridgeline surrounding the ranch. Vincent Hartwell had come in person to witness what he expected would be Thunder Creek Ranch's final humiliation, accompanied by a dozen hard-faced men whose demeanor suggested they were comfortable with violence. "Miss Rivera," Hartwell called from his position on the hillside, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp morning air. "I trust last night's events have clarified your situation. The Territorial Development Corporation is prepared to be generous, despite the unfortunate circumstances, but our patience isn't unlimited." Dylan felt his jaw clench at the man's arrogant assumption of victory. A month ago, he might have responded with the kind of angry outburst that had characterized his behavior in Tucson. Instead, he found himself thinking tactically, considering options and consequences rather than simply reacting to provocation. "What's he really after?" Dylan asked quietly, keeping his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to the watching riders. "Control," Cass replied. "This isn't just about buying ranches. It's about proving that independent operators can't survive against corporate pressure. If Thunder Creek falls, every small rancher in the territory will know that resistance is futile." Marcus studied the assembled riders with the analytical eye he'd developed through years of evaluating business risks. "He's made another mistake. Those men aren't local ranch hands. They're hired guns brought in from outside. Sheriff Bradley will recognize the difference immediately." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses echoed from the valley floor. Sheriff Tom Bradley rode at the head of a substantial posse that included not just deputies, but armed citizens from Copper Ridge and neighboring communities. Alina Vasquez rode beside him, her expression grim but determined, while behind them came ranchers and business owners who decided that Hartwell's campaign threatened everyone's security. "Mr. Hartwell," Sheriff Bradley called as his men spread out to surround the corporate riders. I have warrants for the arrest of anyone involved in last night's arson attack. You and your men can surrender peacefully, or we can do this the hard way." Dylan watched the confrontation unfold with fascination, noting how quickly the dynamic shifted when Hartwell found himself outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The corporate bully who'd seemed so confident when terrorizing isolated ranchers looked considerably less impressive when facing organized community resistance. "You have no proof of our involvement in any criminal activity," Hartwell replied, but his voice lacked its previous arrogance. "We were simply observing from public land." "We'll let a territorial judge sort that out," Bradley responded. "But first, you're going to compensate Miss Rivera for her losses and guarantee that these mysterious accidents will stop immediately." The standoff stretched taut as both sides assessed their options. Hartwell's hired guns were outnumbered 2-1 by men who fought for their homes rather than wages, while the sheriff's presence meant that any violence would have legal consequences, extending far beyond the immediate confrontation. Dylan found himself studying the faces of Hartwell's men, noting the subtle signs of uncertainty that suggested their loyalty had limits. These were mercenaries rather than true believers, and mercenaries understood survival mathematics better than ideology. When Sheriff Bradley began reading arrest warrants, several of them exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their commitment to Hartwell's cause. "This isn't over," Hartwell warned as he turned his horse toward the Eastern Trail. "The Territorial Development Corporation has resources you can't imagine. You're fighting progress itself." "No," Cass replied, her voice carrying across the valley with quiet authority. "We're fighting greed disguised as progress. There's a difference, though I understand why someone like you might not recognize it." As Hartwell and his diminished force retreated, Dylan experienced a revelation that would shape his understanding of strength and leadership for the rest of his life. The victory hadn't come through superior firepower or individual heroics, but through community organization and strategic preparation. Cass had defeated a better-funded enemy by building alliances and thinking several moves ahead, like a chess master setting up an inevitable checkmate. "How did you know they'd come last night?" Dylan asked as the immediate excitement subsided and people began assessing the damage. "Hartwell's predictable," Cass explained. "He operates according to a pattern that works in most situations. Isolate the target, apply increasing pressure, then deliver a decisive blow when resistance weakens. His mistake was assuming we'd follow the usual pattern of response." Marcus joined their conversation, his expression thoughtful as he processed the morning's events. "You turned his strength against him. Instead of trying to match his resources, you made his resources irrelevant by changing the nature of the conflict." "Exactly." Hartwell brought hired guns to fight ranchers, but he found himself facing a community instead. Mercenaries don't fight well when they're outnumbered by people defending their homes. The lesson resonated with Dylan on multiple levels. For months, he'd tried to solve his problems through confrontation and rebellion, matching force with force in a pattern that inevitably led to escalation and defeat. Watching Cass handle a much more serious threat through intelligence and preparation showed him a different model of strength, one based on wisdom rather than aggression. The cleanup and recovery process that followed provided its own education in resilience and community cooperation. Neighbors who'd driven out to help with the standoff stayed to assist with rebuilding efforts, turning the aftermath of destruction into an opportunity for strengthening relationships and improving ranch infrastructure. Dylan found himself at the center of these efforts, his documentation skills making him valuable for insurance claims and legal proceedings, while his growing understanding of ranch operations allowed him to contribute meaningfully to reconstruction planning. The sullen teenager who'd arrived 6 weeks earlier had become someone people relied upon, whose opinions carried weight in adult conversations. "You've changed," Elena Vasquez observed as Dylan helped her organize supplies for the rebuilding effort. "Not just grown up, but changed in fundamental ways." Your father must be proud. Dillon glanced across the yard to where Marcus was working alongside Sheriff Bradley to coordinate security measures. I think we've both changed. This place does something to people, makes them see possibilities they never knew existed. Cassandra, has that effect on people? Elena agreed. She sees potential where others see problems, finds ways to help people become better versions of themselves. That's a rare gift. As the day progressed, Dillon began to understand that his education at Thunder Creek Ranch had moved beyond personal development into something larger and more significant. The skills he'd learned and the confidence he'd gained weren't just individual achievements. They were preparation for a lifetime of contributing to communities and standing up for principles that mattered. The arrival of a territorial marshal later that afternoon brought new complications and opportunities. Marshal James Patterson had ridden down from the territorial capital with warrants for several of Hartwell's associates and authority to investigate the Territorial Development Corporation's business practices throughout Arizona Territory. We've been watching this situation for several weeks, Patterson explained to the assembled group. What happened here last night was just the most visible part of a pattern that extends across multiple counties. Your documentation and witness statements could be crucial for building a case. Dillon's careful record suddenly took on new importance as evidence in a territorial investigation that could reshape land ownership patterns throughout the region. His precise observations and analytical approach had created a resource that legal professionals found invaluable, transforming a teenager's school assignment into testimony that might influence territorial policy. This is what I was hoping would happen, Cass confided to Dillon as they reviewed his journals with Marshal Patterson. Individual ranches can't fight corporate pressure alone, but documented patterns of illegal behavior can trigger government intervention that levels the playing field. You planned this from the beginning, Dillon realized. My record-keeping wasn't just busy work. It was building a legal case, partly, Cass admitted. But mostly it was giving you meaningful work that contributed to something important. The legal value was a bonus. The real goal was helping you discover what you were capable of accomplishing when you applied yourself to something that mattered. That evening, as the last of the visitors departed and normal ranch routine began to reassert itself, Dillon found himself reflecting on the transformation that had occurred not just in himself, but in his relationship with his father. Marcus had proven himself capable of physical courage and community leadership, while Dillon had discovered reserves of maturity and responsibility he'd never known he possessed. What happens now? Dillon asked as the three of them sat on the porch, watching stars emerge in the clear desert sky. Now we rebuild, Cass replied. The barn needs to be replaced, the security measures need to be improved, and the community cooperation we've developed needs to be maintained. This victory doesn't end the threat. It just changes the terms of engagement. Marcus leaned forward in his chair, his expression serious but hopeful. Dillon, I need to ask you something important. Your education here has obviously been valuable, but eventually you'll need to decide what you want to do with what you've learned. What do you mean? I mean you have choices now that you didn't have before. You could return to Tucson and complete your formal education, perhaps study law or business. Or you could stay here and help Cass expand the ranch operation. Or you could find some combination that uses both your intellectual abilities and your practical skills. Dillon considered the question carefully, understanding that his answer would shape not just his immediate future, but his entire approach to life. 6 weeks ago, the choice would have been simple: escape from parental authority and return to the familiar comforts of urban life. Now, the decision required balancing multiple factors and considering consequences that extended beyond his personal preferences. I want to finish my education, he said finally, but not the way I was doing it before. I want to study things that matter, that help me contribute to communities like this one. And I want to spend summers here, learning from Cass and helping with the ranch. The compromise satisfied everyone while avoiding the kind of either-or decision that might have created new conflicts. Dylan would have the formal education his father valued, while maintaining the practical connections that had transformed his character, creating a foundation for adult life that combined intellectual development with genuine purpose. As night settled over Thunder Creek Ranch, the lessons of the past month crystallized into a new understanding of strength, leadership, and the relationship between individual development and community responsibility. Dylan Webb had arrived as a troubled teenager seeking escape from consequences. He was becoming a young man who understood that true strength came from accepting responsibility for others' welfare as well as his own. The education would continue, but its focus had shifted from personal reformation to preparation for a lifetime of meaningful contribution. Thunder Creek Ranch had given Dylan more than discipline and work ethic. It had given him a vision of the kind of man he wanted to become and the communities he wanted to help build. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities for growth, but tonight, for the first time in his life, Dylan Webb knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. That knowledge, more than any formal education or inherited wealth, would be the foundation for everything he accomplished in the years ahead. 3 months later, the territorial courthouse in Phoenix buzzed with anticipation as the case against the Territorial Development Corporation reached its climax. Dylan Webb sat in the witness section, his carefully maintained journals spread before him like a roadmap of corporate corruption and community resistance. The nervous teenager who'd arrived at Thunder Creek Ranch had been replaced by a confident young man whose testimony would help determine the future of land ownership throughout Arizona territory. The transformation was evident not just in Dylan's bearing but in his understanding of the larger implications surrounding the trial. This wasn't simply about punishing Vincent Hartwell for his crimes against individual ranchers. It was about establishing precedents that would protect communities throughout the American West from similar corporate predation. Marcus Webb observed his son's preparations with quiet pride, recognizing competence and maturity that extended far beyond Dylan's 16 years. The banking expertise that had once seemed irrelevant to ranch life now provided valuable insights into the financial mechanisms Hartwell had used to manipulate land deals and eliminate competition. "Remember," Cassandra Rivera said quietly as Dylan reviewed his notes one final time, "tell the truth clearly and let the facts speak for themselves. Hartwell's lawyers will try to portray you as a privileged city boy playing at being a cowboy. But your records demonstrate serious analysis and genuine understanding." The courtroom filled with representatives from across the territory as Judge Samuel Morrison called the session to order. Small ranchers sat alongside territorial officials, newspaper reporters mixed with local business owners, and the gallery buzzed with the electricity that accompanied cases of genuine historical significance. Dylan's testimony began with a detailed account of his arrival at Thunder Creek Ranch and the systematic education in ranch operations that had followed. But as he described the escalating pattern of intimidation and sabotage, his narrative transformed from personal memoir into damning evidence of corporate conspiracy. "Can you describe the conversation you witnessed between Mr. Hartwell and Miss Rivera on September 15th? Asked the territorial prosecutor, a sharp-featured woman named Catherine Mills who'd built her reputation on complex fraud cases. Mr. Hartwell claimed to represent the Territorial Development Corporation in making what he called a generous offer for Thunder Creek Ranch. Dylan replied, his voice steady despite the packed courtroom. But when Miss Rivera declined to sell, he made statements that could only be interpreted as threats. What specifically did he say? Dylan consulted his journal, though he remembered every word with perfect clarity. He said that small ranchers face many challenges, including disease, predators, and accidents. He suggested it would be better to accept reality before circumstances forced her hand. The prosecutor nodded approvingly. Did you interpret this as a threat of future violence? Combined with subsequent events, yes. Within a week of that conversation, 15 head of Miss Rivera's breeding stock were poisoned. The timing and methodology suggested deliberate sabotage rather than natural causes. Hartwell's defense attorney, an expensive lawyer brought in from Denver, attempted to undermine Dylan's credibility through aggressive cross-examination. But months of ranch work and community responsibility had given Dylan confidence that no amount of legal maneuvering could shake. "Young man," the defense attorney said with condescending authority, "isn't it true that you were sent to Thunder Creek Ranch because of behavioral problems? That your testimony might be influenced by gratitude toward Miss Rivera for reforming your character?" Dylan considered the question carefully before responding. "I was sent to the ranch because my father hoped I would learn responsibility and develop stronger character. Those goals were achieved, but they don't alter my ability to observe facts and record them accurately." "But surely your emotional attachment to Miss Rivera might color your interpretation of neutral business negotiations." "My attachment to Miss Rivera is based on respect for her integrity and competence," Dylan replied. "Those same qualities make me confident that my observations and conclusions are reliable." The exchange continued for over an hour, but Dylan's composure never wavered. The combination of intellectual preparation and hard-earned confidence proved unshakable, and by the time cross-examination concluded, even Hartwell's expensive lawyer seemed discouraged. Cassandra Rivera's own testimony provided the broader context that transformed individual incidents into a pattern of systematic intimidation. She described similar cases throughout the territory, documented through correspondence with other ranchers and territorial officials, creating a comprehensive picture of corporate overreach that extended far beyond personal grievances. The Territorial Development Corporation's methods represent a fundamental threat to the principles that built the American West, Cass explained to the packed courtroom. Independent ranchers and small communities create the diversity and resilience that make territories prosper. Corporate consolidation eliminates that diversity in favor of short-term profit maximization. Marcus Webb's testimony focused on the financial mechanisms Hartwell had used to manipulate land transactions and eliminate competition. His banking expertise allowed him to explain complex fraud schemes in terms that judges and juries could understand, while his personal transformation at Thunder Creek Ranch demonstrated the human cost of corporate intimidation. Mr. Hartwell and his associates didn't just threaten individual ranchers, Marcus explained. They threatened the entire economic ecosystem that supports territorial development. When small operators are driven out of business through illegal means, it creates artificial scarcity that inflates corporate profits while destroying community stability. The prosecution's case culminated with testimony from territorial officials who'd been investigating similar patterns throughout Arizona and New Mexico territories. Deputy Marshal Catherine Hughes presented evidence linking the Territorial Development Corporation to illegal activities spanning 5 years and dozens of communities. What we discovered during our investigation was essentially a criminal enterprise, disguised as legitimate business, Hughes testified. The corporation used fraud, intimidation, and violence to acquire properties at below-market prices, then consolidated those holdings into massive operations that eliminated local competition. Vincent Hartwell's testimony in his own defense proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. His arrogant demeanor and contemptuous attitude toward small ranchers alienated the jury, while his attempts to justify illegal activities only provided additional evidence of criminal intent. "These people don't understand modern business practices," Hartwell declared from the witness stand. "The territory needs efficient, large-scale operations that can compete in national markets. Small ranchers are obstacles to progress that must be removed through whatever means necessary." The prosecutor seized on this admission with devastating effectiveness. Mr. Hartwell, when you say whatever means necessary, are you including the poisoning of livestock, arson attacks, and threats of physical violence? I'm including normal business practices that weak-minded people might misinterpret as threatening, Hartwell replied, apparently unaware of how his words sounded to the jury. Dillon watched this self-destruction with fascination, recognizing the same arrogant blindness that had characterized his own behavior before. Thunder Creek Ranch taught him to consider consequences and other people's perspectives. Hartwell's inability to understand how his actions affected others had led directly to his downfall. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on charges of fraud, conspiracy, intimidation, and criminal mischief. Judge Morrison sentenced Hartwell to 5 years in territorial prison while ordering the dissolution of the Territorial Development Corporation and restitution to all affected property owners. But the legal victory represented only part of the transformation that had begun with Dillon's arrival at Thunder Creek Ranch. The real triumph lay in the community, networks, and cooperative relationships that had emerged from the struggle against corporate intimidation. 6 months after the trial, Dillon stood on the rebuilt porch of Thunder Creek Ranch, watching the sunset painted Mesa Valley in shades of gold and crimson. The ranch had expanded significantly with new buildings and improved infrastructure, funded partly by restitution payments and partly by investments from territorial officials impressed by the operation's efficiency and community integration. More importantly, Thunder Creek Ranch had become a model for community-based education that attracted visitors from throughout the American West. Young people from troubled backgrounds arrived regularly to learn the same lessons that had transformed Dillon's character, while their parents often stayed to participate in the kind of meaningful work that had rebuilt Marcus Webb's relationship with his son. Any regrets about staying in Arizona instead of returning to Tucson? Cassandra Rivera asked as Dillon completed his evening inspection of the horse corral. None whatsoever, Dillon replied without hesitation. Everything I needed to learn was here. The Territorial College Extension Program gives me the formal education Father wanted, while the ranch work provides the practical experience that makes that education meaningful. Marcus emerged from the main house carrying correspondence from territorial officials who'd been monitoring the ranch's educational programs. His own transformation had been as dramatic as Dillon's, from a distant businessman to an engaged father who understood the relationship between meaningful work and personal fulfillment. The territorial governor wants to visit next month, Marcus reported. He's considering legislation that would provide funding for similar programs throughout Arizona and New Mexico territories. What do you think? Cass asked Dillon. Ready to help other young people find what you found here? Dillon considered the question seriously, understanding that his answer would shape not just his own future, but potentially the lives of hundreds of troubled teenagers throughout the territories. The responsibility was daunting, but the months at Thunder Creek Ranch had taught him that meaningful challenges were opportunities for growth rather than threats to be avoided. I think that's exactly what I want to do with my life, he said. Finally, not just working with individual kids, but helping build communities where people can discover their potential and contribute to something larger than themselves. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Tom Bradley, whose monthly visits had become social occasions rather than official business. The lawman's presence reminded them that their victory over Hartwell had created lasting changes in how territorial authorities approached corporate crime and community protection. Heard from Marshall Patterson today, Bradley reported. 3 more territorial corporations have been indicted based on evidence patterns similar to what you folks documented. Your case created precedents that are protecting communities from California to Colorado. Dillon felt a deep satisfaction at the knowledge that his careful record-keeping had contributed to justice, extending far beyond Thunder Creek Ranch. The analytical skills his father had tried to develop through formal Education had found their proper application in defending communities and exposing corruption. As evening settled over the valley, the ranch prepared for another day of the routine that had become second nature to Dylan. But beneath the familiar patterns of animal care and property maintenance lay a deeper understanding of how individual growth contributed to community strength, and how personal responsibility created the foundation for broader social progress. Elena Vasquez arrived from Copper Ridge with her weekly supply run, accompanied by a new family whose teenage son showed all the signs of the angry confusion that had once characterized Dylan's behavior. The cycle of transformation was beginning. Again, with Dylan now prepared to serve as mentor rather than student. "Remember your first day here?" Cass asked as Dylan helped the newcomers settle into the guest quarters. "I remember thinking this was punishment disguised as education." Dylan replied with a laugh. "I never imagined I'd find my life's purpose mucking horse stalls and fixing fence lines. But that's exactly what happened. You discovered that meaningful work and genuine responsibility could provide satisfactions that mere comfort and privilege never could." The insight captured something essential about the Thunder Creek Ranch experience that extended beyond individual transformation to broader questions about community development and social progress. Young people needed challenges that tested their capabilities and opportunities to contribute to something larger than their immediate desires. As night fell and the ranch settled into its peaceful routine, Dylan began composing the weekly report he sent to territorial officials, documenting their educational programs and community development initiatives. The writing had become natural to him, combining the analytical skills his father valued with the practical wisdom he'd gained through months of ranch work. The story of his transformation from troubled teenager to community leader would be told and retold throughout the territories, inspiring similar programs and encouraging other families to seek solutions through meaningful work rather than empty privilege. But for Dylan, the real satisfaction lay not in his growing reputation, but in the daily opportunity to help others discover their own potential for growth and contribution. Marcus watched his son work with quiet pride, recognizing maturity and purpose that extended far beyond anything formal education alone could have provided. The banking fortune that had once seemed like the most important gift he could Dylan now appeared almost insignificant compared to the character and wisdom the young man had developed through his own efforts. Thunder Creek Ranch had given Dylan more than discipline and work ethic. It had given him a vision of the kind of community he wanted to help build and the confidence to pursue that vision despite obstacles and setbacks. The lessons would continue throughout his life, but the foundation had been established through the patient guidance of a remarkable woman who understood that true strength came from service to others rather than domination over them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities for growth. But tonight Dylan Webb knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. That knowledge, more than any inherited wealth or formal credentials, would be the foundation for everything he accomplished in the years ahead. The legend of Thunder Creek Ranch was just beginning, but already its influence was spreading throughout the American West, proving that the right combination of challenge, responsibility, and community support could transform not just individual lives but entire societies. The rancher had indeed become more than a teacher. She had become the architect of a new model for human development that would echo through generations. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.